Thank you, and thanks everybody for coming back from lunch. Can I ask a question before we start, which is, I always like to find out if there are economists in the audience when I'm speaking to a neuroscience audience and vice versa, because that really helps me calibrate a bit. So if you're an economist, or consider yourself an economist, would you raise your hand? Okay, so let me just add one thing then. Since there's only one of you here, or only one person brave enough to admit that, like me, he's an economist, I'm going to sometimes play a little loose with jargon. And when you hear me talking about utility and things like that, what I really mean is an object we call subjective value, which is the cardinal neural correlate, unique and cardinal neural correlate of utility. And in questions, we can explore what these formal objects really look like at a mathematical level. That's not going to be probably the way I'll talk about it in this audience. OK, so my goal here is to do basically three things with you. I know there are only two things here. The first thing is I'm going to give you a quick overview of what is neuroeconomics and why it is, I think, the right way to study human and animal decision making as an interdisciplinary enterprise. Then I'm going to take about 20 minutes out, and I'm going to tell you what we know about the neural machinery that makes decisions when you or another primate faces a situation that requires a choice. I think that people don't appreciate how much has been learned in the last 10 to 15 years about the basic architecture for this process. We now have a good view of the outlines of that system, and I think it's useful as a point of departure for us to share that understanding during the first 20 minutes. And then I'll turn to the kinds of work that we do in my lab today, and I'll tell you about one particular project that a group of my postdocs have been working on, which tries to blend normative neuroscientific theory, anchored to efficient coding in the nervous system, with economic theories of choice in an effort to derive a kind of new approach to efficient or normative economic decision making. Now, the basic premise of neuroeconomics is extremely simple. For the last 200-300 years, there have been at least 3 groups of scientists, maybe 4, who've been studying how people make choices. Economists are probably the largest group. They're interested in macroeconomies, large-scale decision-making, how it is that people make choices, what their preferences are. And they study that using formal normative tools, and more recently some tools that have been taken from psychology. Psychologists have been interested in decision-making for centuries, and they ask, how is it that our mental states influence decision-making? Certainly for the last 50 years, neurobiologists have been interested in a kind of decision-making, usually very simple decision-making. And their working premise has been that what we should do is trace out the pathways of the nervous system that we need in order to make decisions. And what we've been arguing, a group of scholars who are economists, psychologists, and neuroscientists, is that what we really need to do is realize that the different levels of analysis — now here I'm showing you a more classical problem, the level of analysis of biology, chemistry, and physics — are linked in important ways. And we've begun to ask whether or not we can build a representation of decision-making at the economic, psychological, and neuroscience levels that are deeply interlocked. The idea is by interlocking these different classes of models, we gain new insights into efficient building of these models, just as understanding the genetic basis of heredity in the 1950s changed both biology and chemistry, and the discovery of the wave equations changed both physics and chemistry. And so the goal, I think, of neuroeconomics, finally, is to achieve a fusion across these different levels of analysis with the assumption that some fusion across these levels will strengthen understanding at each of the levels. And here I'm not really, for the philosophers in the audience, arguing for hard full reductionism at all. I guess I'm arguing weakly for partial reductive linkages. And I'm making that argument from a historical position, which is that it's always worked in the past, and we might as well assume it will work in the future until we see otherwise with regard to decision. Now that sounds very abstract, and let me outline for a moment why I see that as important, especially since there aren't a lot of economists in the audience. If I asked you, how would you study someone making a decision? What you'd probably do is you'd say, well, first, I'd study the way sensory information about the things I'm deciding about, let's say whether or not to pull my foot away from this fire, how that sensory information enters the nervous system, where that sensory information makes connections with motor neurons or interneurons, and how those motor neurons or interneurons ultimately gain control of the musculature. And it's that path from sensory to motor which a good physiologist like me was trained to think of as the basic way to understand decision making. But what's striking is how differently psychologists and neuroscientists think about that problem from the way economists think about that problem. And I could have picked a number of people as my sort of anchoring lights. Here I picked Paul Samuelson. What Samuelson, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, argued was that if we wanted to understand decision-making, what we had to do was understand what the representation underlying the decision-making ought to look like. What he focused on was a class of decision-making tremendously important to economists. Oh, my slides are out of order here, sorry. Is a class of decision-making we call consistent decision-making, and it's about these that he was able to make really clear statements about what the underlying representation ought to look like. Consider a chooser who prefers apples to oranges and oranges to pears. Samuelson said, do we know anything else about that chooser once he reveals these two preferences? We might like to imagine that we can assume that he prefers apples to pears. And Samuelson simply asked, if that's true, if the chooser prefers apples to oranges, oranges to pears, and thus apples to pears, can we make any deep statements about the underlying representation which would be guiding his decision-making? Now, this is a really important point. It was a subtle point, and it took a century for people to understand it. So to make this point, I want to show you what an inconsistent chooser looks like. This is someone who prefers apples to oranges, oranges to pears, but pears to apples. The reason that's a terrible thing to an economist, I mean, this is really a horror to an economist, is for this reason. So these are supposed to be two members of my lab, or recently graduated members. Ifat Levy, now an assistant professor at Yale, and Stephanie Lazaro, now a postdoc at UCL in London. And so Ifat has a pair. These are her preferences. And she has 3 US cents. So they're not worth as much as your cents. And Stephanie walks up to her and says, hey, I'll trade you this orange for your pear if you'll give me a cent, which we can think of as epsilon money. And Ifat consults her internal preference structure. She says, oh, I prefer oranges to pears. Good deal, I'll do it. And she comes out of this feeling better because her welfare has been increased. So Stephanie then yanks out of her satchel this apple and offers to trade the apple for the orange. Again, Ifat consults her internal preferences and experiences an increase in welfare. And of course, here's the problem. Stephanie then pulls out Ifat's old pear, turns to Ifat and says, I'll give you back your pear for that apple plus 1 cent. And Ifat makes the trade and feels real good about it because each decision respected her internal preferences. And for economists, that's a really terrible thing. For, of course, Stephanie, that's a really good thing because she can run this game as long as she wants. But what Samuelson noted was that a chooser who obeys this rule, this is basically the axiom of transitivity, is a chooser who behaves exactly as if he had some internal representation of the value of each of the goods, that internal representation is, let's say, monotone with quantity. That's usually the way we express it. And that when he makes a choice, all he does is consult the things that are being offered to him, construct a representation of the subjective value of those different offers, and pick the one that's highest. So Samuelson would never have said this, but you might, as a neurobiologist, say, oh, what Samuelson ought to kind of have been thinking was somewhere inside the brain, there's probably a representation of the values of apples and oranges and pears, and that this representation of value is probably what guides human choice behavior through some winner-take-all or argmax operation, and that ought to be kind of the default model. Now, what's interesting about that story, for me, are 2 things. One is the objects, as an economist, we're going to begin to look for, the subjective value of a good, that it's monotone with the number of apples, things like that. Those are concepts that are entirely missing from the classic physiology view. Physiologists say they're studying decision-making, but they're missing all those pieces. Reciprocally, the same is true. Economists say they're studying decision-making, but are very adamant classically in the 1940s and 50s about the idea that these preferences and these monotone utility representations are not in the person or in the brain or physically instantiated in any way. They are as-if representations. This is a key feature of economic thought until quite recently. And so we make no commitment to the idea that they're true. All right, so what we're going to try and do is blend those 2 traditions. And of course, that's something that's been done now for the last decade and a half and quite successfully. I'll just mention one other thing. I told you about consistency across goods. Von Neumann and Morgenstern are particularly famous for having developed a set of axioms that explain not just consistency with regard to value or subjective value, but consistency with regard to probability. And they laid out axioms about how you would think about the representation of a decision variable when the outcome of your decision was probabilistic. So working loosely from their framework, we could think about a situation in which a thought was offered a choice between an apple, which I'll arbitrarily say has a value to her of 3 units of utility, an orange with a value of 2, and a pear with a value of 1. But when she picks the apple, she knows there's only a 50% chance that Stephanie will give it to her, an 80% chance that she'll get the orange, and a 1 unit probability guaranteed that she'll get the pear. From the product of these, we can compute a decision variable, something like expected utility. And the presumption here is that if thought picks the orange because it has the higher decision utility, well, actually, if I'm an economist, I'm going to say that the other way. The observation that if thought chose the orange under these conditions reveals that it had the higher decision utility. So the critical question then is to ask, how do you combine these two sets of insights? And that's really been the fundamental working program in much of neuroeconomics for the last decade. How do we combine an understanding of the pathways that make choices with an understanding of the representational frameworks that are required for efficient choice? Now, I'm going to take you through a bunch of experiments. They're really cartoons of experiments that have been done over the last 10 years. I'll mention a few real experiments, but I just want to now capture what we've learned over the last few decades, and I'll focus, of course, on my own work or the work of my colleagues in lab, but you should understand that lots and lots of labs have contributed to this. And I could tell this story probably just as well with somebody else's work. But it would be less fun for me, of course. OK, so the very first experiment of this kind, I think, trying to mate these two approaches, was the one conducted by my old postdoctoral fellow, Michael Platt. Michael is now the director of the Institute for Neurosciences at Duke. And what Michael did when he was in my lab was trace that pathway, sensory to motor, and park his electrode in awake-behaving monkeys halfway along that pathway. And the working idea here was, well, if there's some representation of the decision variable somewhere in the brain, the first place to start looking for it would be halfway between sensory and motor. So what Michael did was go into parietal area LIP and record from a single neuron, which we believed was telling us something about a decision to look 10 degrees to the right. Now, on another day, he might record from a neuron that told us about something about making a movement 10 degrees to the left. But let's just focus on this cartoon neuron. And then what he did was he trained his monkeys to play what I think of as roulette. So in this game of roulette, the monkey fixates. 2 roulette targets appear, one red and one green. One is associated with the neuron we're studying in its response field. And the fixation light is yellow because it's about to change color. You can think of the roulette wheel as spinning at this point. And here the fixation light turns either red or green. If it turns red, the monkey looks at the red target and collects his reward. If it turns green, the monkey looks at the green target and collects his reward. What we're going to do is we're going to sort out all the trials on which the fixation light turned red. But we're going to look at blocks of 100 trials which differ in what the reward the monkey expects to receive for looking at that red target are. Now, from Sherrington's point of view, from a classical physiologist's point of view, this experiment's kind of uninteresting. The same fixation light comes up on all these trials. It changes color. The same stimulus occurs on every trial. The same action occurs on every trial. I've selected out the trials that are identical in sensory and motor. What they differ in is the monkey's expectation about the utility of making this action. And Michael simply asked, do the firing rates of the neurons reflect this expectation of the utility of an action? And here I'm plotting for you the average firing rate of an LIP neuron. Let's focus just here on this early period when the offer is made, not when the decision occurs. And you can see there's a dramatic increase in firing rate when the monkey expects to receive a large reward for that action, and a less dramatic increase when he expects to receive a small reward for that action. Of course, Michael studied a lot of neurons, and he studied them not under 2 conditions of expectation, but typically under 7. And here I'm plotting the firing rate of an LIP neuron as a function of the relative value, the gain ratio, of the target in the response field divided by the sum of the target in and out. All that matters here is that this is a measure essentially of something like the utility of that response, or the expected utility of that response. And you can see there's a nice roughly linear function here. But I also want to draw your attention to the fact that what Michael found, what the regressions show, is that the firing rates really for this typical neuron go from 0 to 100 hertz. And that's important because these are cortical neurons, and we all know biophysically that cortical neurons can only go from 0 to 100 hertz. So this isn't one of these little, you don't want to say, oh, this neuron does a lot of interesting things, and 1% of its spike rate can be accounted for by your data. 100% of this neuron's dynamic range can be accounted for by Michael's data. And of course, that turned out to be true if Michael varied not just the magnitude of reward, but here the probability of reward. So here's a block of roulette trials in which there's a 50-50 chance of going red or green. Here 80-20, here 20-80. And once again, Michael showed that the firing rates were high when the animal expected there was a high probability of getting a reward for going to the red target, and low when the monkey expected there was a low probability of going to that target. OK, so that was neat, and it's, I think, an important first step. It demonstrated that along the sensory to motor path physiologists have been studying for the better part of a couple of centuries lay neurons which seem to encode the decision variables economists had been thinking about as arbitrary mathematical objects for about 200-300 years. Now, I'm going to sort of flesh that out for you, but the way I'm going to do that next is I'm going to sort of zoom in on this chunk of the brain, the lateral interparietal cortex, and I'm going to capture in what you might think of as a simulation. It's more data representation, what's going on. Now, I stole this picture, or I was given this picture by David Van Essen. Here, the brain's being inflated, and the only thing I want to remind you of is that cortex is a two-dimensional object, right? It's a flat sheet. And the interparietal area in the monkey, what we call IPS1 and IPS2 in the human, are regions up around here. But what's extremely important to remember is that they're two-dimensional objects. They're sheets of neurons. And what we want to ask is, what's the topographic representation in these sheets of neurons? Now, we spent a lot of time working on that problem, and this is a paper that David Heeger and I produced years ago. We produced a series of about 3 papers on this subject, trying to demonstrate the existence of 2 LIP-like objects in the interparietal sulcus of humans. And I spent hours explaining the slide until I finally gave up and decided to show my friend Marty Serino's version of this experiment, which is not only simpler, but has a video. And you'll see I learned this lesson, and I learned it well. So here what we're looking at in the center is an aggregation of a tremendous amount of data. This is the left IPS1, interparietal sulcus area 1, and the right IPS1. And whenever it targets at this location, we're asking, where in IPS did we see activation? And as the chiclet sweeps up here, watch what happens here. This band of activity sweeps back, and as it sweeps down, the band of activity sweeps down on the other side. And what this is revealing to us is that the IPS is a topographic map of the stuff you can look at. Every location on this topographic map is sort of paying attention to the value of something at a particular location in eye movement space. So let me aggregate that for you. And to do that, what I'm going to do is show you a data aggregation by one of my Canadian postdocs, Ryan Webb, who went to Queen's. Nothing personal. And so here's what Ryan's showing you. He's showing you a 100 neuron by 400 neuron sheet. Each neuron's a vertex on this mesh. And we're going to report the firing rates. You want to think about this as LIP. This is left LIP, and this is right LIP. This location here might be all the neurons that care about 10 degrees to the right. This might be all the locations that care about 11 degrees to the right. This might be 12 degrees to the right. Everybody get this idea? And so what happens when we light up a target that's associated with a reward at this location? Well, this will be unsurprising. What we see is a distributed pattern of activation at the location, centered at the location on the map that corresponds with 10 degrees to the right. Now, it's spread because of local excitatory Gaussian distributed connections that we know quite a bit about, but which I'm not going to focus on right now. What happens if we light up 2 targets? Well, we know, because these experiments have been done a ton of times. Now I've added Ryan's added something close to physiologic variability, noise. You can see these 2 hills of activity now. But here's the really interesting point. What happens if we show a monkey 2 targets which have different value? A high value target and a low value target? Well, you already know the answer to this from what I showed you before. It leads to a high peak of activity associated with the high value target and a low peak of activity associated with the low value target. So how do you choose? Well, we know quite a lot about that. We know mostly from slice data. But the answer seems to be we perform what an economist would call the argmax operation, what a neurobiologist would probably call a winner-take-all operation, in which these two peaks essentially compete for control of the network. Now, your intuition should be this. There's a local Gaussian spread of activation at this location on the map, and that's true of every location on the map. That's why you get these broad distributed peaks. And we also know that every location on the map is connected directly or indirectly with every other location on the map in an inhibitory fashion. That, of course, means that activity at this site not only reinforces his neighbors, but inhibits all of his distant opponents. And so you can think of the networks as coming built with this sort of fighting property, which is who gets to control the network. Data from slice seems to indicate, and this is the work of Bill Hall at Duke, that what actually happens when we make a choice is that the local excitatory connection gain goes up across the whole network. That causes the peaks to compete more strongly with each other, causing one of the peaks to win. And once activity crosses a fixed biophysical threshold, it actually triggers the generation of the response. And all of these pieces have now been pretty much seen. Now, I've made it sound, to make it simpler, like there's only one network that does all this work. That's absolutely not right. This is kind of showing you a slightly bigger view. Here I'm showing you the three main, by no means the three only, networks involved in this process. The one in the parietal cortex, the one in the frontal cortex, and the one in the superior colliculus in the brainstem. We know that these networks are reciprocally interconnected. That means that if I inject a value signal here, it percolates through the network to all locations. And we know that the neurons here in the superior colliculus have a nonlinear threshold. As soon as they, and only they, cross 100 Hertz, the state of the network changes fundamentally. It becomes broadly inhibitory. One peak goes through the roof to 1200 Hertz, and that movement is initiated. So this is what that looks like in simulation. Here we've injected a value signal into LIP for two targets. You saw it quickly percolate through the network. And now we'll converge the network by changing the excitatory tone here. And you'll see that percolate through the network until the colliculus crosses its biophysical threshold and stops the simulation. And so what you can see here is a pretty decent standard neurobiological story. I mean, there actually are no surprises here, right? This is sort of Hubel and Wiesel topographic mapping of the world meets Samuelson representation of value. I actually think this is a kind of uninteresting thing in many ways, because if you had to guess how you would do it, this is probably the way you would have guessed it. But at this point, all these different components have been measured, and it's satisfying to see, that we get that far. But of course, for an economist, what I've told you is, I think, the economist in me is singularly unimpressed by this. Because what I've shown you is how it is that we represent the current offers in a choice set and how we compute the argmax, the selection process. And that's kind of the least interesting part to an economist. The most interesting part to an economist is how the preferences are represented and where they're represented and how they're learned and how they're influenced by context. And to understand that, we have to understand not how the choice network operates, whether we're talking here in this slide about the choice network for arm movements, or as I showed you in the last slide, the choice network for eye movements, or the choice network for mouth movements, which we know a little bit about, but where it is that value comes from. Now, the studies of value have been a big focus of neuroeconomic research over the course of the last decade, let's say. And I'm going to collapse a huge amount of data and draw your attention to one brain area here, located actually in the middle of the default network areas, called the medial prefrontal cortex. Literally hundreds of studies now indicate that whenever we search for the neural representation of the value of something that is highly subjective in a human, that subjective valuation is represented by activity in this brain area. If you are patient and would rather wait for a large later reward in the delayed reward task, this brain area reveals that patience in the valuation or activity it associates with that delayed reward. If you're impulsive, you can see that here too. If you like apples, versus oranges. You can see that here. If you hate salty tea, a favorite of John O'Doherty's lab, it's really nasty salty tea. We see it as what looks like we see it as a suppression of the bold. I'm not saying anything about activity there, at this location. And so what's emerged over the course of the last decade is a widespread conviction by a number of laboratories now that a group of brain areas pool information into two common final targets, the medial prefrontal cortex and the ventral striatum. Lots of labs are now beginning to refer to these as the final common path for valuation, stealing a phrase from Sherrington. And that it's this final common path for valuation which provides the input to the choice circuit we were talking about before. Now, a number of labs have gone on to show that that seems to be true. And obviously, the way to show that it's true is to measure activity in this brain area and show that you can use activity in this brain area to predict what people's preferences are. I'll tell you in a moment about the neatest version of that, which was just done in Maastricht the last few months. This is our version. This was the work of Ifat Levy, who I mentioned earlier, and Stephanie Lazaro, who I also mentioned earlier. And what Ifat and Stephanie did was use a localizer procedure I'm not going to tell you about to find the region in the MPFC that seems to be associated with value representation, totally independent process. And then they took subjects, NYU undergraduates, and they threw them in the scanner. And they had them do basically nothing other than look at consumer goods. So a consumer good would appear. They'd stare at this. This is now. I should have said when the kids come into the lab as subjects, all these consumer goods are laying around in the lab. So you say, oh, look, here are all these consumer goods. You're going to see some of them, and they're real. And we're going to have you make some choices over the course of the experiment. One of your trials is going to be realized, and you'll get that thing. So one of these puppies you're going home with. And so you might want to take a moment to familiarize yourself with them. And they lie in the scanner. And we show them these things. Here's this DVD. This is a Monet. Actually, there's not a Monet in the lab. This is a 20-inch Monet poster from Amazon. But it's a real poster, and it's in a nice little frame. And it's kind of dorm room appropriate. And OK, so now what do we get out of that? Here's what we get for a typical chooser. We get an activity measure for each of these consumer goods in what I'm arguing is sort of the final neural representation of preference. So here you can see the largest bold responses to this Moleskine notebook in this subject. And unfortunately, the maximal suppression is to this Beethoven CD. This is my favorite. These are intermediate goods for this kid. For this kid's MPFC, this is an Acon CD. See, this is good because I like saying that because it makes me feel cool. And because in the faculty of the front row are like, what is he talking about? So Acon is a rap singer. And, and so this is fun because I actually didn't know what Acon was until this study, but now I look cool. OK, so these are activities. And of course, here's the prediction. The prediction is that if I now pull the subject out of the scanner and show him all pairwise choices between these goods, which would you rather have, this Moleskine notebook or this Beethoven CD, I ought to be able to predict, if I'm right, that he prefers the Moleskine notebook. Now, let me say a couple things about the economics here. I'm going to present what we would call an ordinal analysis. We have completed fully cardinal analyses of this. They rely on random utility models, which are a little more complicated, which I would love to talk about. But I'm going to skip those, and we're just going to try and get predictions right in an ordinal ranking system. OK, so here's the deal. Your intuition should be, if I'm asked to compare two things 19 rank apart, our predictions should be great. And if we're asked to predict two things 1 rank apart, our predictions should be a chance. OK, so the kids then come out of the scanner. We sit them down in the next room. Which of these two would you prefer? They tell us with a mouse. We show them in random order all pairwise comparisons. Then we reverse the left-right order. That gives us some power in the random utility model because we can look for indifference points. This is kind of what that looks like, just because it's fun. So these are NYU students' favorite items and least favorite items by 3 students. So here's the kid you just looked at who hates Beethoven and loves Moleskine notebooks. This kid likes money. These are monetary lotteries included for calibration, and hates dodgeball. So I guess, you know, whatever, he's a business student. And this person likes Nora Jones and hates Akon. So it's hard to fault that kid. OK. So here's what we found. And this was really just the first time this had been done. We found that when the 19 distance objects were compared, we could get it right about 87% of the time. And that performance degraded smoothly to essentially 50% as we went to the adjacent items. Now, I should add that, you know, a lot of labs, mine included, are struggling with how to make these things more accurate, how much information's in the brain. Let me go there in 1 second. And so there's a very beautiful MVPA linear regression approach that's just being finished by Rainer Goebel's group at Maastricht, which has now got the prediction level up to about 94%. And so I think it's now we're getting to a place where you can do this kind of prediction at a reasonable level.
So is the way to read this chart, like the highest bar is the most favored item versus?
No. So this is how accurate are we in percent correct for items that are 19 apart, highest and lowest. And we are right 87% of the time. Okay. How right are we for goods that are 3 rank apart? And the answer is, you know, within error 50%, we're a chance. I think it is monotone. OK, so that's a great, so there are no real error bars here. This is a great question. The error model here turned out to be insanely complicated. And so instead what we did was write the random utility version, which is on SSRN if you want to go look at it. And within our estimate of the error term, the random utility model is monotone. Yeah.
I was going to hold this off to the end, but maybe we
No, this is fun. I'm enjoying this. So.
Okay, sounds good. Can we go back one slide?
Mm-hmm.
Start maybe one.
You don't want this slide?
No, there was the one where you had the various different preferences. Yeah, this one here.
No, wait, don't say preferences. This is neural activation.
So why is it that the neural activation is higher for $10 or $0 than for $20?
Oh, that's so great. No, that's great. OK. So I'm going to write this down. This is so interesting. So the subjective value for some good I, right? Now this is, how should I say this? Let me do it the other way. I do it backwards. So let's imagine there's a true subjective value, which is the mean neural activity that you get. Every time I go in, I get a slightly different neural activity because neural activity is random. So we usually call that nu sub I. And nu sub I is equal to the mean nu. Nu sub I at time t is the mean nu plus some noise term. And we think of this as what your true preferences are. They're varying because neurons vary.
Sure.
OK. So now I'm going to try and measure that object using the brain scanner, which sucks. So that's my measurement error term, right? And so this is, and now the truth is I also have to pass this through the choice operator. OK? So the choice operator is this parietal signal, and it actually has a noise term too. So what we think of as this gets passed up to the parietal cortex. These should all be, the noise terms should be indexed probably. So this is the aggregate choice object. This is what an economist would call the utility, because this is the decision variable. And for us, what's interesting is this is your real preference, and it varies from round to round, and it's what you want to maximize. This is actually what you choose on. Sorry, this is what I measure in LIP, and this is what I choose on in LIP, right? And so if you write all this out and do all of the time integrals, you can actually try and estimate what all these different error terms are, right? And we get a little handle on it because we actually get indifference numbers out of the choice because we show them each choice twice. OK, so in a sense, we could calibrate the stochasticity of this noise term and this noise term against the stochasticity of all 3 of these noise terms, which show up in the scanner, and ask, what's their relative magnitude? This is kind of neat because it's one of the only times you can go into a scanner and say, I know what my signal of interest is, and I want to know how big it is compared to the noise term with my measurement technique aggregating across all these voxels. And the answer is it's about 16 to 1 m bigger. OK?
You've just gotten really unlucky with this 20 to 30.
I'm not really unlucky. I'm lucky that I got anything vaguely monotone at 16 to 1. Okay? Good? This is a really fun subject, and we waste all our time talking about it. So in my lab. So I urge you to go to the SSRN website and download this paper. Ryan Webb is the first author. And it sort of will outline, it's called neural random utility modeling. And it'll outline how we estimate all these things. Okay, blah, 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 blah. That's the model. So now, what I want to do is flesh out that model and show you how a neuroeconomist actually goes about using this kind of approach and this framework to think about a slightly harder problem. So what I want to do now is focus on something that many of you who are computational or theoretical neurobiologists know about, and that's this notion that what neurons, particularly in the sensory cortices, do is maximize the amount of information they carry about stimuli. This notion of information maximization really has its origin. Steve Grossberg actually figured this out first and typically wrote it in a form that no one could understand. Heeger then reinvented it to Steve's horror and patented it. So it's now usually called Heeger normalization. But I want to get the idea that Heeger was trying to capture and that Steve was trying to capture across this way. Here's an image. It's the simplest possible image I could imagine. It's a two-dimensional Gaussian, just flat up on that screen. Now let's zoom in on that image. Let's think about a tiny chunk in the middle of that image and look at it at this scale. The first thing that you notice is that the pixels are non-independent. Imagine I had 9 neurons whose firing rates were going to encode the contrast of each of these 9 pixels in space. Well, an obvious way to do that would be to simply commit 10 spikes to a black pixel, 0 spikes to a white pixel, or the reverse. And so, of course, my 9 neurons would each be firing at 10 spikes in this cartoon example. And the result is I'd be spending 90 spikes of neural energy in order to code this location. But it should immediately be obvious to you that that's a dumb idea. If you knew ex ante that in real-world images, adjacent pixels' luminance was correlated at 0.75, and I told you that all of these ring pixels were black, you would pretty much know that this central pixel was black. And you'd know it without wasting 9 spikes to encode it. And so really, I think the first person to recognize this was Horace Barlow. And so what Horace really said was, geez, the nervous system ought to know that. And what it ought to do when it sees things that it already knows is only capture what's new information and not waste spikes or energy on things that are already known. And the way David implemented that in the first model of this was with this famous Heeger normalization model. What he basically said was that the firing rate of a V1 neuron is what it's looking at, this is the numerator, how high contrast its target is, divided by the sum of all of its nearest neighbors. He actually said later that, and the way we really think about it, is that it's the weighted sum. And the weight tells us something about the correlation between that other element and the current element. 2 guys are next to each other, and they're correlated at 0.75. That weight is 1 over 0.75. 2 guys totally uncorrelated, the weight there is 0. Everybody got this idea?
No one has been a number of neighbors?
You also have to do that. So can we punt on that for the moment? I'll write out either the discrete or the dynamic version of the differential equations last. Because, it's like, you guys all know this. You who are younger, do not fall prey to this. All I really want to do is write out the differential equations, because that's all I really think about. But then everyone will be bored except the 2 of us. So I will wait on that. But we've got to do it, because it's really cool. OK, so here's the idea. And it was really proven by Eero Semicelli's group, mostly with Odelia Schwartz and Marty Wainwright. What they basically said is the way to maximize the information in an array is for the firing rate to be equal to, forget this is non-interesting constant, what's in the response field divided by a weighted sum of all of the neighbors, where the weighting function you can think of as the covariance matrix. This is essentially a decorrelation operation. And a network that does this achieves maximal decorrelation, or let me say that another way, it achieves maximum information for its size. So if you tell me how much information you need, with this kind of equation, I can tell you how big a network you need to carry it. And if you tell me how big a network you have, I can tell you what the maximum amount of information you can shove in for a given world correlational structure, a given set of omegas. Now what's neat about this is that this has turned up as a pretty canonical calculation in pretty much all studies of sensory cortex. It's been observed in V1 now, in MT, in V3, in V4. It's been observed in IT. It's been observed in auditory cortex. It's been observed in olfactory cortex. It has even been observed, heaven forfend, in the olfactory bulb of Drosophila. For a mammalian neurobiologist, that's a terrible thing. And so a lot of us have really come to the view that one of the things cortex does is maximize its information representation, that it does this normalization process canonically. Now, what about choice cortex? What about all these choice areas I was telling you about? Well, this kind of operation kind of might make sense if we think about choice cortex too. Imagine I have a monkey who's going to choose between offers of juice of different magnitude, ranging from 1 milliliter of juice all the way up to 999 milliliters of juice. He has to map that into a firing rate, right? And let's imagine our neurons have a fixed firing rate range, like all cortical neurons, of 1 to 100 hertz. That's easy. 1 milliliter of juice counts in my little LIP model as 1 spike per second. And 999 milliliters of juice counts in my little LIP model as 99 spikes per second. That's great. Now what happens if I offer my monkey a choice between 1 milliliter and 2 milliliters of juice? That's actually a very easy choice. Monkeys always get it right. But here we're asking the monkey to choose between 1 spike per second and 1.01 spikes per second. And you all know that neurons are stochastic enough that that's a really hard problem. And we have every reason to expect monkeys would never be able to do that well, let alone solve a problem like 110 microliters versus 118 microliters, which, by the way, they're great at. But if we think about these normalization representations, it begins to suggest how this problem might be solved. Imagine a network that's, let's just start with 2 targets, one which has 1 milliliter and one which has 999 milliliters. So the firing rate of this neuron is 1 milliliter. Let's forget about the constants for the moment. Divided by the sum of all the offers, which is 1,000. So this is 1/1000th of its maximum firing rate. And here, this is 99 over 1,000. So this is essentially its maximum firing rate. If we now switch to make an offer of 1 versus 2 milliliters, this is now firing at 1 over 1 plus 2, 3, 1/3 its maximum firing rate. And this is at 2/3 its maximum firing rate, still an easy choice. In a way, what we've done is an operation you can realize is really decorrelation too. We're solving the problem that choice sets tend to have correlation in their magnitude of offer. But the critical idea I want to get across here is this idea that we might well expect that cortical normalization of the kind that maximizes information in the visual world might also arise in this system, and it might maximize information in the decision world as well. Now, to begin to ask that question, Kenway Louie, a research assistant professor in my lab, designed this experiment. And I'll show you 2 experiments of Kenway's. The first one's really simple, and it looks a lot like the original Platt experiment on purpose. Here's a monkey staring straight ahead. 2 eccentric targets illuminate, one in the response field of the neuron, one outside. The fixation light switches here to either red or green, and then turns off, cueing the monkey to look at the correct target and collect its reward. What I showed you before was that if we change the magnitude of the reward in the response field, the neurons track that. But in a normalizing system, the neurons would also track, in a negative way, the value of the target outside the response field. Because the relative value of this fixed target would be going up or down based on the relative value of this target. So all Kenway did was run exactly this experiment. And here what we're looking at is the uninteresting data set from a neuron in the top, a population in the bottom. Here we're holding the value of this target outside the response field constant and changing the value of the target inside the response field and here's the population, as the value of the target in the response field goes up, firing rate goes up. Big deal, you knew that. But sure enough, as the value of the target outside the response field goes up, firing rate in the response field goes down. So what these neurons code is not the value of a target, but something like its relative value. And the hint is, if they're normative, if they're maximizing information, decorrelating choice sets, what they ought to be doing is this normalization representation. Now to test that, Kenway designed a more complicated experiment that involved 3 targets. So here are 3 targets. This target is always going to be a unit reward. This target is always going to be a half unit reward. And this target is always going to be a double unit reward. This will allow us, for any magnitude of unit reward, to construct 7 possible situations. Now the monkeys go through this elaborate procedure where they have to learn the values of each target, and then each day. And not only do they have to learn them, but they have to be uncertain about what they're going to be asked to do, so they're sort of keeping track of everything. And I'm skipping telling you all about that. And I just want to draw your attention. So here's a situation in which this target, unit reward, comes on, and that's it. Unit reward and a small one outside, unit reward and a big one outside, unit reward and 2 outside. So here's the relative, the ratio, the value. And here is the baseline suppression situation. There's nothing in the response field but a growing value outside the response field. And the question is, what do these do to the firing rates of the neurons? So here's the firing rate for this condition. Now we add a little target outside. Bink, we get just a little suppression. And a big target outside and a bigger suppression. And a bigger pair outside and bigger suppression. And here's the baseline case and the 2 cases of baseline suppression. OK, so now we can replot that. Come on, little guy. Using this equation. And the critical thing, if you've tracked all this, I mean, I haven't really told you much about this term sigma square. This is the normalization constant. For people who are thinking about the math here, what this actually is the expectation, the median expected firing rate. And it actually emerges as the equilibrium state of the network. But I'm not going to really talk about that. So what we're going to be looking for is how firing rate observed is related to firing rate predicted. And I'm going to leave sigma squared for right now a free parameter that's fit to each neuron. And here are there is a target in the response field. Here is the baseline suppression condition. And you can see there's a really pretty good lineup here. This is not so interesting. Let me just say this. For people who've been recording an LIP, most of you know there's this huge industry recording an area LIP. Or for neuroscience terms, it's a huge industry. And my lab and all of my students, like for a time immemorial, record an LIP. And Newsom and Shadlin and their students record an LIP. And we throw rocks at each other. And this is a rock Shadlin and I threw against each other for 20 years. This was our V1 divided by V1 plus V2, our original relative representation model, predicted against observed. And it does OK. And here's Shadlin's. This is actually Leo Segru's dissertation, but it's the Shadlin model. And this is the normalization model. And it explains why we were able to throw bricks at each other. I mean, this is a really good model. It really accounts for all the variance. And it really looks like what these things are doing is coding something like the Heeger normalization equation with regard to value. And I have to stress that the sigma term, this constant, which distinguishes this model from this model, that's this term, is a really big number. And it is about the expectation term. And we can talk more about that in a moment. OK. So next thing I got to remind you of, how bad am I? Oh, I'm doing great. OK. The next thing I got to remind you of is that I've been talking now about mean firing rates across a trial. So I want to remind you now that what we're really talking about is stochastic objects. Each of these neurons, physiologists just sort of know this. And nowadays, I think theoretical neuroscientists know this too. But there was this gap 10 years ago where a physiologist would say, this neuron fired at 10 hertz. And in the head of the theoretical neuroscientist was pop, 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 pop. And in the head of the physiologist was pop, 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 pop. Well, probably in the theoretical neuroscientist there wasn't this soundtrack, but all physiologists believe neurons talk, and so Now, we've known that neurons are stochastic. We've known for a long time. This is the famous Tolhurst, Mofshin, and Dean paper from 1983 showing that the variance as a function of neuronal rate is essentially a straight line with a slope of slightly greater than 1. Interesting fights about exactly what that number is. All we really care about now is that I remind you that when I tell you that there's a normalization equation running, what I really mean is not the average value is being normalized, but some set of distributions of firing rates are being normalized. Let's look at that. So on the left, what I'm showing you is a sort of traditional cortical model. What every neuron codes in its firing rate is how many milliliters of juice you stand to get, or it's monotone with milliliters of juice. And here's an offer of, let's say, 2 milliliters of juice outlined in blue. And this is the distribution of spike rates you might get on a particular draw for that milliliter of juice. And here's a slightly worse offer outlined in black. And of course, here's where the tails of the distributions overlap. I'm just showing this as a Gaussian to keep it simple. I know they're not Gaussian. And this overlap point is where you'd make a mistake. Now, if we add a third option of low value, well, so what? Because its tail is not long enough to meaningfully interact with these two. And so if I say to somebody who's using a normal absolute value coding LIP, which would you rather have, A, B, or C, they might once in a while they might say B when they should have said A, but they certainly will never say C. And the value of C is kind of irrelevant as long as they don't pick it. But what's interesting in an information maximizing system is that it doesn't have that property. Remember, the firing rate is now presumed to be the offer divided by the sum of all the offers. That means that as a third crummy option increases in value, it has the effect of pulling down the firing rates associated with the other options. And it causes those firing rates to overlap more. Now, this may be a little bit counterintuitive. I'm showing you a simulation in which there is a fixed noise term for people who are tracking this, and the fixed noise term is doing most of the work in this simulation, but we've been able to show numerically that this is true of for all known estimates of the variance firing rate relationship, that you'll get this increase in overlap. Okay, so here's this weird prediction. This is what the take home now. So here's a situation in which I'm asking a human or a monkey to choose between the red good, the blue good, and the black good. This is a distribution of firing rates. And I ask how often, with random draws from each one. This is numerical, and it's Kenway's work. Do I get it right? And I get it right 98% of the time. I find the red one. Now, all I'm going to do is I'm going to add another crappy black option to the black distribution. And you can see it pulls the red and the blue toward each other. And it drops the accuracy with which you can find A. Now I'm just going to show you what happens as we add what we think of as distractors. And so what I want you to see is something weird for an economist, which is, for me as an economist, which is that this system violates IIA, the axiom, the loose choice axiom, the independence of irrelevant alternatives. The likelihood that I can pick the red option depends on the number and value of undesirable options that the chooser never, ever, ever picks. So it actually, it's worse than that. That's great. So in economics, this is called the axiom of regularity. And so of course, sorry, sidebar, I apologize. The assumption should be that with these Gaussian distributions, whose tails go on forever, there will always be a likelihood that you will pick from the crappy option. And as I add more and more options, the likelihood you'll find the good option will deteriorate. And that should be true of any system, and all standard random utility models include that prediction. When the stochastic accumulation of values precisely predicts that accumulation of error, this is called regularity in economics. And we can prove analytically that this is significantly worse than regularity. and that no variance distribution that's ever been explored in a random utility model produces this class of regularity violations? That's a great question. Okay, so blah, 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 blah. Okay, so I'll just show it to you this way. Here are, I'm going to show it to you, here are two options and a crummy third option. You should pick this one, but noise makes it a little hard. And now I've just stepped up the value of this third option, and now you can see it's a lot harder to find the good option. Right? So this is just so you can see visually what's going on. I think I'll skip this because there's only one economist in the room. This is a choice simplex, and the critical idea here, for anybody who knows how to read a choice simplex, this is probability you'll pick 2, probability you'll pick 1, probability you'll pick target 3. The midpoint means you pick all 3 equally. IIA says you follow down these straight lines. Standard McFadden random utility models and most of the LUMS models predict bowing out. And we get bowing in towards the center line. And this is the signature of our regularity violation. But forget all that. Here's all I care about. Here's choice efficiency as a function of the value of a third alternative. So here's a crazy way to restate what I just said. The model predicts that if I make you an offer of 3 options, A, B, and C, and I increase the value of C on the condition that I will never increase it so much that you ever pick it, the presence of C and its magnitude will control how good you are at the A-B choice. Right? This is a choice anomaly. No one's ever seen that choice anomaly, but it came out of this neurobiological architecture, so we immediately said, well, geez, no one's ever seen this behavioral economic anomaly, but can we find it? And of course, the first place we looked for it was in the monkeys. So here, Kenway designed exactly the experiment that is shown in that last choice space. There are going to be 3 targets. One of the targets will always offer 0.156 milliliters of juice. A second target will sometimes offer less, 0.13, sometimes the same, 0.156, sometimes more, 0.182. And the monkey should obviously, when choosing between these two, pick this one. When choosing between these two, be indifferent. And when choosing between these two, pick this one. But we do it under 2 treatment conditions. When the third target is basically worth nothing, just positive of nothing, it's epsilon. And when it's worth something, but not enough that the monkey ever, ever, ever picks it. OK, so here's what that data looks like. And what I'm plotting for you are 2 monkeys. This is the probability they pick 1, the better target. Let's see, the right-hand target. Here is when the right-hand target is worse than the left-hand target. Here's where they're equivalent, and here's where it's better. A monkey who was perfect at this task would make a step function here. He's pretty steep at this, and these are, microliters. And so now the question is, and this is, when we have only the small distractor. And here's what happens when we just increase the value of the distractor. You can see that curve flattens out. Now, for a non-economist, it might not be clear how big a difference this is. This monkey here is going from finding the better target 80% of the time to finding the better target only about 67% of the time. This is a huge effect. And he is never touching the bad target. OK, so this, for us, this is really kind of where, let's see, blah, 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 blah. For us, this is really the kind of direction you want neuroeconomics to go. And I'll flesh this out in a moment as I finish up. Because what did we do? We started with standard computational neuroscience, the theory of efficient coding in cortex. And we asked, does the theory of efficient coding in cortex predict firing rates in choice cortex? When we checked, the answer was yes. Then we asked, what are the implications of that representational framework for choice? It made novel predictions of a new kind of choice anomaly, which we were able to find in the monkeys. Of course, it's reasonable at this point to ask us, can you find this in humans? And the answer to that turns out to be yes. We've just finished a study in which humans play a simple valuation experiment that basically is exactly the monkey experiment you saw before. In it, humans are shown each of 30 different snack foods. They're 4 hours food deprived. They come into the lab. We use an incentive-compatible mechanism called the Becker-de-Groot-Marschak bidding tool to get them to tell us what each one of those goods is worth to them. So they bid on it, essentially, in a complicated auction process. Here you can see the bid. Let's just do this one. The bid against good. And so this is the good they bid the least on. This is the good they bid the most on. This is incentive compatible because one of these trials will be realized, and they'll get to buy that good, and they'll eat it in the lab. It'll be the only food they get for the morning. Kids usually bid at about twice the market value, which is surprising. I would expect they would bid more. And then we'll pull individual elements, a distractor of increasing value, and two targets off this set to fully sample the choice space and look to see if we get the same efficiency declines in humans. And the answer, in a nutshell, is yes. Sorry, that's the prediction. We see this. This is logistic slope. So this is a big effect encoded here. We see this factor of 2 decrease in choice efficiency as a function of the movement of the distractor even in humans. And we don't know whether this happens for durable goods and things like that. Those are good, important economic questions that we're working on. So that's kind of neat. If you're a computational neuroscience, you can kind of like declare victory at this point and say, that was nifty. Computational neuroscience improved the theory of representation in a predictive way, not only with regard to neuroscience, but also with regard to choice. But at heart, I'm really an economist, and so I really want to know, what are the normative implications of that? Like, why does the brain do that? That seems so screwed up. What's happening here? As the distractor moves up in value, people are essentially violating transitivity more and more in their choices. In the language of economics, they're leaving money on the table. They're leaving money, happiness, and utility on the table by picking the wrong thing. So here I've shown you a neural architecture that looks like what it does is throw away money. Let's go here. I think that's the wrong way to think about it. See, the brain's actually doing 2 things. One is trying to guide our choices efficiently, and the other is paying for its hardware, a fact which economics has until recently been forced to ignore. Let's think about a monkey with an LIP of variable size. Let's look in red first at the cost of an LIP of increasing size. As the number of neurons I use for encoding goes up, well, I'm an economist, so this is a low-cost thing. That's good. This is a high-cost thing. That's bad. And we have good reason to believe that costs are roughly linear with number of neurons. And so as I increase the number of neurons, it costs more and more to have that LIP. Now, what does a bigger and bigger LIP do for me? Well, it allows me more and more space to perform my representation in. So it means that my representations are going to overlap less, and I'm going to be more transitive in my choices. I'm going to get it right more. So if we plot that in blue, imagine a straight blue line. As we increase the number of neurons, we could imagine that the quality of our choices is going up. We're capturing more of the value on the table. And of course, the normative piece of the Simoncelli model is the bow of this line, which says that the more efficiently I code the covariance structure of the choice space, the more this blue line shifts essentially from being a straight line to being a bowed out line. And the point of maximum bowishness is where I've captured as much information as I possibly can for any given size cortex. So what's the idea here? The idea is that the brain is really trading off 2 problems. The bigger the brain, the more transitive, the less money left on the table. The smaller the brain, the cheaper the brain, but the more money left on the table. Is it in principle possible for our brains to capture more value? Yes. How would they have to do it? To do it, they'd have to be bigger. If you wanted to have an order of magnitude scale up in the accuracy with which you capture this information, if you had an order of magnitude scale up in the human brain, well, think about that for a moment. The human brain consumes 20% of our energetic needs. Don't worry, this is it. I can see that Chris is getting nervous. The human brain captures 20% of our metabolic needs. A factor of 10 scale up means that you have to eat 3 times as much food. So having a order of 10, factor of 10 scale up of your brain efficiency, better yield 3 times as much intake, right? If it only improves you by 20% and not by 3,000% or something, then it was a bad choice. It was a bad bargain because you spent a lot more for a brain that didn't do that much more for you. So what we're arguing essentially now is that it's something actually that Herb Simon argued 40 years ago. What Simon said is sometimes the human nervous system satisfices. Sometimes it does well enough because the costs of computation are so high. The problem was Simon at that point had to wave his hands around because what exactly was meant by the cost of computation wasn't known. But now we know a lot more and we can impose restrictions. And it looks like when we impose reasonable restrictions on the cost of computation, we can actually build models in which the cost of computation is one of the economic costs that's being maximized. And when we do that, a lot of these weird behaviors, we think many of the behaviors that are thought of as odd in behavioral economics really fall out as solutions, dynamic programming solutions to a classical optimizing problem. And for us, that's really where neuroeconomics goes. It's an effort to fuse across disciplines, but to derive meaning from the interaction of constraints at different levels of analysis. Thanks very much. I'm only 5 minutes over.
I'm going to stand up.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, in any case, we can open the floor to questions. If you would like to give them.
Yeah, let's do someone else, but I don't want to do that one.
Yeah, so I'm just kind of trying to get a sense of how you're modeling decision making. And I'm guessing that you sort of myself, and I'm not really asking anything full, but I guess what I felt like was missing was the amount of effort it takes to make a decision. So like maybe if the monkey person is presented with many different decisions, then they have to take longer to arrive at that. So that might mean like more neuronal activity overall. And I'm just kind of wondering how the amount of brain activity kind of fits in with the whole decision-making process.
No, so this is, all right, that's great. The decisions I told you about on purpose are basically flat with regard to reaction time. So let me do this in 2 steps. And let's first think about the best studied variable reaction time data set in neuroscience. And that's, of course, the original Shadlin-Newsome data set, in which what's essentially happening in the standard model. So I'm going to reveal to you that this is the drift diffusion model. It's the same thing. I can prove it, but I'll give you the intuition. So in the drift diffusion model, the idea is there's some barrier bound for choice A and some bound for choice B. And this is the start point, and some imaginary particle bounces around. And when it crosses the bound, the monkey reports his choice. And there's some distribution of correct and errors. These are time distributions. OK, so now
Just very quickly, like if you have like more options and there's like more directions on this graph, like it's possible.
Oh, well, let's not do multi-option choice, because let's do that. Save that for a moment, because that's actually a huge problem with this particular model.
Am I right or wrong about that?
You're wrong about that. This model actually doesn't generalize to multi-option choice.
Okay.
Though the generalized random utility framework does.
Okay, great.
So I have to show you a pretty elaborate mapping to get there.
Totally fine.
OK, so how do we think this works? The way we think this works is the bound. Remember, I showed you this terrific picture of the superior colliculus, these 3 big areas. And I said the superior colliculus has a threshold. And that threshold actually is set by the excitatory tone globally of the network. And in our decisions, that we study in my lab, what we tend to do is say, monkey, here's all the information. Think about it for a second. Decide within 150 milliseconds. And what we think happens is that the excitatory tone of the network abruptly jumps. Now, you could do it a different way. You could set the excitatory tone of the network such that when the mean input crossed some limit, the system burst. OK? So now the bounds turn out in this model to be the excitatory tone of the network. And so when a monkey learns what bound to set, what he's learning to do is set the excitatory tone in the collicular network, and then the information just pours in from the moving dots when he has enough evidence so that the spike rate has crossed that threshold, the movement occurs. And it produces essentially this behavior. Now, exactly the way I described it, the problem is that the drift diffusion model which is so popular, approximates the normative solution only in a limited range. It approximates it only for two-option choice. It approximates it, for technical reasons, only in a narrow time window with a certain class of priors. And the random utility framework is the generalized form of this model. And so it's easier to sort of think about this in RUM space for me, because it's the general form. But it has all the features I just described to you easily captured.
If I were to ask you after this for a few references, would you be able to do that?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I was really interested in the comments made about Herb Simon just at the end there, of the idea of satisfying, about your referencing the system as opposed to the rationally satisfying after. I was wondering if you might speculate or even have information on what the neuroeconomics of a satisfying actor would be. Would it be more expensive to be satisfying actor than an optimizing one? Do you think that this model in some ways approximates that?
So that's a great question. Well, so let me reveal. So I can't get away without revealing my religious belief as an economist that whatever we're doing, it's perfect. I know that's not true, but I have to hold that belief. So so my bias is that it's more efficient until proven otherwise. And stuff like this really stands out for me. I'm not going to tell you about reference point effects. Those of you who know about choice know that there are these big reference point effects. And it's widely known that if, you've experienced a lot of, this is a classic reference point effect. You go to New York City, my hometown, into a hotel, and you ask for a Coke at a hotel restaurant. And the guy says, it'll be $6, please. And you say, whoa, I will take 5 milliliters, please. And you go into town here and you ask for a Coke, and it's what it is everywhere, which is $1. That's your expectation, and you buy a Coke. And you might think this is sort of law of supply and demand. As the price is going up, your demand is going down. But it goes down much, much, much faster than that. Much, much slower than that. Sorry, much, much slower than that. People are more willing to spend money in that $6 environment than you would derive from their elasticity. And we think of that violation of rationality, because it makes people money pumpable by the hotels, as a problem. It actually emerges from the dynamic structure of the equations I'm showing you in time. I didn't show you the real time equations, but it actually turns out that it's an efficient coding in time strategy, just like this is an efficient coding in space strategy. So we think that a lot of satisficing behavior is easy to describe as maximizing once you bear in mind costs and limited capacity representations. This is now becoming a very big ticket item in economics, where maybe because economists are clever, or maybe because they're bloody-minded, I have to just, that's hard for me, it being both. This is called rational inattention, as opposed to just being called attention. And the idea is that it is rational to not pay attention to some things because of limited capacity. So I think a lot of people are working on this. In the next 5 years, you'll see this really blossom as a subfield.
One last question.
Oh, well, OK. All right.
So I'm not a neuroscientist. Just a question that when you give the choice to the monkey to select from, then you repeat the choice, the experiments again, do you think that the prior knowledge might affect the decision?
That the
prior knowledge?
Oh, yeah, definitely, definitely. So the way we do the experiment, which I kind of skipped, I'm looking at Chris, and he's like getting agitated, so I'm going faster and faster at that point in my talk. Although it was only 4 minutes over. Is the monkey samples option A, he samples option B, he samples option C, he gets a choice, and then we scramble them. So the monkey knows that he's in what we call a mini block. And we get his choice in a mini block, and then we repeat. The issue of, I am certain that if we let the monkeys practice, they'll converge on the correct choice and just stay with it. Absolutely. Their noisy representation is not going to bug them, because you're right, they'll reinforcement learn with a small alpha using their dopamine systems what the action is that has the highest long-run expectation.
Okay, great. So
Just so everybody knows, there is drink and food. There will likely be a line again, but it is available down in the room where it was before. And so let's thank Paul once more.
Thank you.